even if somehow this miraculously were to be solved today, if there were a democratic transition in Venezuela and it was somehow miraculously put on a path to greater growth and better, the problem is that, first of all, China and Russia's influence remains strong. Rosneft, the Russian oil company, has basically floated Venezuela's debt for the last couple of years. It now owns a number of contracts or leases for exploration throughout Venezuela that probably will remain well after the current president, Nicolas Maduro, steps down or however he leaves. As I mentioned, China owns about $75 billion worth of debt that Venezuela obviously owes China. There's a strong bloc of countries that are obstructing regional norms in the inter-American system. The hemisphere has sort of a small minor league United Nations, and it's called the Organization of American States. In 1991, then again in 2001, the Organization of American States committed all 32 members to defending democracy in very, very specific ways in what was called the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And in that, the Organization of American States committed its members, and all of them signed it, to when there was an interruption in the democratic process, or when the checks and balances of democratic practice were collapsed or crushed or not respected, the Organization of American States would convene, agree to kick out that member country, and then could voluntarily impose sanctions. The problem is that's never actually been done. Because the Chavez government, and now the government under Nicolas Maduro, who was elected in 2013 after Hugo Chavez died of cancer, basically has been so weakened, so corrupted by this patronage of buying out the Caribbean allies, that even in May of this year, when the OAS agreed to meet to discuss whether the convening of the Constituent Assembly, unconstitutional Constituent Assembly, the jailing of over 100 political opposition leaders, over 300, the detention of 100 political opposition leaders, if that constituted a violation of democracy, they could only get, 20 of the 34 member countries to agree that that constituted a violation of democracy. In other words, that democratic consensus that existed in 1991 and 2001 had evaporated. He had basically this government had bought its way out of any international accountability. And when they threatened to raise this issue before the Organization of American States of Venezuela's democratic violation, Venezuela did something that shouldn't have shocked us, but unfortunately didn't provoke much of a reaction. They just said, you know what, we no longer belong. We're out of here. We're done. Only 2 years earlier, when the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, a human rights body in the hemisphere that comprises about a dozen jurists who make recommendations and monitor human rights conditions, when they criticized the Venezuelan government for closing down an independent media station, Venezuela said, you know what, we're out of here. We no longer belong here. In other words, this government is not only violating and crushing institutions within its own country, it's violating them and crushing them regionally, which will have a very damning impact. And this is what my point is, that the region until recently, for reasons that sometimes even defy explanation, has been largely passive on what is the total collapse of Venezuela. This is completely unprecedented. We're not looking at the sort of past authoritarian governments of, say, Argentina or Chile under Pinochet. This has been the systematic disarticulation of a state, the complete corruption of an economy, and the destruction of a society and its social bonds that has become so deeply polarized. I don't mean to be negative. I can talk about other countries that I'm far more positive about. I simply don't see how Venezuela turns the corner in any time soon. And I'll talk about that in the next. And U.S. leadership here has gone back and forth and hasn't always been, under any administration, been all that compelling. 40 individuals in the government have been sanctioned by the Treasury Department for narcotics trafficking, for violations of human rights, or for corruption. That includes the vice president, it includes the president, it includes all members of the Supreme Court, it includes a number of ministers. All of them have been tied basically to various forms of corruption, crackdown, and dissidence, which means They can't travel to the United States. They can't, the visas have been yanked, and any assets they held in the United States have been frozen. In addition, the the Trump administration recently imposed sanctions on the government that make it illegal for any U.S. bank to issue new debt to Venezuela. So this whole exercise of trying to restructure the $60 billion in debt that I mentioned earlier that's owned either by the government or various government corporations, U.S. banks can't go near it. There'll be violation of U.S. law if they actually try to refinance this debt, which is why I'll argue I think Venezuela is about to probably default. That said, the U.S. also hasn't been particularly consistent on Venezuela. At the OAS General Assembly in June, Tillerson didn't go. When there were hearings, I mentioned the Inter-American System on Human Rights, Inter-American Court, when the U.S. was itself called before the Commission for questions on human rights, the U.S. either refused to attend or insulted the Commission. This is under the Trump administration. In the region right now, we have 17 U.S. ambassadorships that are unfilled. Okay. At the same time, while we've been sanctioned over 40 individuals, it's never been entirely clear what exactly the strategy is.